Today is Monday, the 30th of October, and my name is Marina Lostal. I'm a senior lecturer at Essex University, and I will be moderating the webinar today that bears the title Massive Trauma and the Healing Role of Reparative Justice. The topics that are going to be covered in today's session include how victims and the families are affected by mass atrocities, the healing role that reparative justice might have, as well as how those processes work in the reparative justice framework of the ICC, International Criminal Court in The Hague. These issues are highly relevant and topical in the current state of affairs. But it is also true to affirm that in reality, they have unfortunately never ceased to be relevant and highly topical, because there's never been a worldwide break in the commission of mass atrocities, serious crimes, and violations of human rights. They still happen to one degree or another, in some place or another, year after year, with one common denominator. They happen to victims whose lives are forever altered. In the course of this new reality for victims, they might come across the assistance of psychologists and lawyers, both professionals who have their own distinct ways of dealing with these issues, will seek and try to achieve peace and justice for victims. Despite their goals being very similar, it is quite uncommon for these two disciplines to be dealt together, which brings us to today's seminar. Just now in the back room, the speakers were talking about how their common goal is to make the world a better place. And this is precisely what the webinar will be about. This webinar is the first in a new series that will be organized by the International Center for the Study, Prevention and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma and the Project Sunflowers, of which I am part. Today's session offers a unique combination of angles because Dr. Yael Danieli and Dr. Philip Ambach will deal with massive trauma and the healing role of reparative justice from a psychological and legal stance, respectively. Dr. Yael Danieli will speak first. She's a clinical psychologist, traumatologist, victimologist, and psychohistorian, professions I don't tend to say very often. Because I'm a lawyer myself. Dr. Danieli is founder, executive director, and senior representative to the United Nations of the International Center for the Study, Prevention, and Treatment of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. She's also director of the Group Project for Holocaust Survivors and Their Children, and past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. She has participated in creating all key international law instruments on behalf of victims' rights and optimal care. Dr. Philip Ambach is the chief of the Victims' Participation and Reparation section at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. He has worked as a legal advisor to the judges of the Appeals Chamber at the International Criminal Tribunals for both the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. He's a guest lecturer in international criminal and humanitarian law at various institutions and has published several academic papers in international criminal law. Before giving the floor to Dr. Danieli, who will be the first speaker, a bit of housekeeping. Presentation of Dr. Yael Danieli will last approximately 1 hour. And then Dr. Philip Ambach will speak for 20 to 30 minutes. You're welcome to write your questions in the appropriate Zoom function at any time, and I will collect them for when the Q&A session starts at the end of both presentations. Now, without further ado, Dr. Danieli, thank you very much for being with us, also taking into account your current circumstances. Thank you doubly, therefore, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marina, for your kind introduction. Emphasizing the need for a multidimensional, multidisciplinary, integrative framework for understanding and engaging with victims of massive trauma and its aftermath This talk examines victim survivors' experience primarily from a psychological perspective. It describes how victims are affected by mass atrocities, their reactions, concerns, and needs. Delineating necessary reparative elements for healing from victims' point of view, I focus on how victims experience not only the outcome, but sometimes even more importantly, justice processes and relationships as crucial to their experience of reparative justice. Although not sufficient in itself, reparative justice is nonetheless a necessary component among the post-trauma healing processes. Missed opportunities and negative remote in place, time, and person experiences will be analyzed to better understand the critical junctures of the trial and victim's role throughout the justice process that can, if conducted reparatively, present opportunities for sustaining healing individually, in the family, community, nations, and in the international community, as well as a sense of the world as a just place. Then we begin with the conspiracy of silence. It was in the context of studying the phenomenology of hope in the late 60s that I interviewed survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. To my profound anguish and outrage, all of those interviews asserted that no one, including mental health professionals, listened to them or believed them when they attempted to share their Holocaust experiences and their continuing suffering. They, and later their children, concluded that people who had not gone through the same experience could not understand and or did not care. With bitterness, many thus opted for silence about the Holocaust and its aftermath in their interaction with non-survivors. The resulting conspiracy of silence between Holocaust survivors and society, including mental health, justice, and other professionals, has proven detrimental to the survivors' familial and sociocultural reintegration by intensifying their already profound sense of isolation, loneliness, and mistrust of society. This has further impeded the possibility of their intrapsychic integration and healing, and made mourning their massive losses impossible. This imposed silence proved particularly painful to those who had survived the war determined to bear witness. Carlson demonstrated that a poor post-war environment, which he calls third traumatic sequence, could intensify the preceding traumatic events, and conversely, good environment might mitigate some of the traumatic effects. Because the conspiracy of silence more often followed the trauma, it is the most prevalent and effective mechanism for the transmission of trauma on all dimensions, both intrapsychically, that is internally, and interpersonally protective. Silence is profoundly destructive, for it attests to the persons, families, societies, communities, nations, and international communities' inability to integrate and constructively respond to the trauma. They can find no words to narrate the trauma story and create a meaningful dialogue around it. This prevalence of a conspiracy of silence stands in sharp contrast to this widespread research finding that meaningful social support that includes validation is one of the most important factors in coping with traumatic stress. This applies as well to justice processes. When done optimally, justice processes can lead societies to begin to dissipate the conspiracy of silence and heal the detrimental effects for both victim survivors and society as a whole. Though descriptions of what is now understood as post-traumatic stress have appeared throughout recorded history, the development of the field of traumatic stress or traumatology has been episodic, marked by interest and denial, and plagued with errors in diagnostic and treatment practices. Indeed, one of the most prevalent and consistent themes during the 20th and early 21st century is the denial of psychic trauma and its consequences, particularly in the myriad deadly conflict that find their multi-generational origins in history, the non-resolution of which ensures their perpetuation. One can only marvel at the international dimensions of the conspiracy of silence, as shown by the slowness of the world community to acknowledge and act on terrible events like those in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Burundi, Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Central African Republic, Syria, Myanmar, and Nagorno-Karabakh. Let me look at impunity as a social instance of the conspiracy of silence. In an interview in 1995, Judge Richard Goldstone stated, "I have no doubt that they cannot get peace without justice. If there is not justice, there is no hope for reconciliation or forgiveness because these people do not know who to forgive. And they end up taking the law into their own hands. And that is the beginning of the next cycle of violence." He says, "I don't think that justice depends on peace, but I think peace depends on justice." Multi-generational findings uniformly suggest that the process of redress and the attainment of justice are critical to the healing for individual victims as well as their families, societies, and nations. Klein underscored its importance for succeeding generation, quotes, "to break the chain of intergenerational transmission of hatred, rage, revenge, and guilt." Justice is understood here, both in terms of the administration of a formal and fair judicial process and the implementation of judgment of courts, and in terms of the complete reparation to victims by governments, courts, and by society as a whole. This process must include the investigation of crime, identification, and bringing to trial of those responsible, the trial itself, punishment of those convicted, and appropriate restitution, all within the framework of reparative justice. The attempted genocide of the Armenians stands as one of the most grievous instances of injustice in this century, one in which none of the necessary steps for resolution of trauma have been taken by the perpetrators. Emboldened by the world's indifference to the Armenian genocide, Hitler proceeded with a systematic attempt to annihilate the Jewish people. Much pain is likely to be prevented in the future if atrocities are stopped and justice done in the present. The struggle for victims and the generations that follow them is to defy the dominance of evil, and find a way to restore a sense of justice and compassion to the world. Victim survivors of trauma feel a need to bear witness to their own and their people's losses, to speak the truth, to be validated, and to urge the world to ensure that such injustices never happen again. But some cannot say never again, because this has happened again in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Sudan, and elsewhere. International justice has acknowledged this. A significant trend countering amnesties and pardons is found in the creation by the United Nations of several ad hoc international criminal tribunals and the establishment by treaty of the Permanent International Criminal Court, or our beloved ICC. Let me move to some aspects of survivor's guilt. One of the most powerful functions of what's called survivor's guilt is to serve as a defense against existential helplessness. Being totally passive and helpless in the face of mass atrocities is perhaps the most devastating experience for victim survivors, one that is existentially intolerable and necessitated psychological defense. Elsewhere, I have speculated that much of what has been termed survivor's guilt may be an unconscious attempt to deny or undo this helplessness. Guilt presupposes the presence of choice and the power, the ability, and the possibility to exercise it. It states, I chose wrong. I could have done something to prevent what had happened, and I didn't. Or there is something I can do, and if I only tried hard enough, I would find what it is. Guilt as a defense against utter helplessness links both survivors and their children's generations to the trauma. The children, in their turn, are helpless in their mission to undo the Holocaust, both for their parents and for themselves. This sense of failure, and I don't just mean Holocaust, please hear it for all massive traumata. This sense of failure often generalizes to, no matter what I do or how far I go, nothing will be good enough. Guilt was one of the most potent means of control in these victim families, keeping many adult children from questioning parents about their war experiences, expressing anger toward them, or, quotes, burdening them with their own pain. The bystander's guilt of therapists, lawyers, and other professionals also appears as a defense when they experience their helplessness to undo the long-term consequences of the trauma for their patients or clients, and stop them too, for example, from asking questions. When victims experience themselves during trials as right bearers, whose views are treated with respect and dignity, this sense of helplessness might be replaced by a sense of efficacy and control, thereby realizing a key goal of reparative justice. Elsewhere, I elaborate on several other functions of survivor's guilt and their implications to both the outcome and process of justice. Those of you who are interested, in the chat, you have the extended work on which this presentation is based. The pervasiveness and misuse in application of the concept of survivor guilt in the treatment of survivors led Carmelli to divide it into two categories, passive and active. Passive guilt, the one actually meant by Nederland when he coined the term survivor guilt, is experienced by those who survived, quotes, merely because they happened to be alive at the time of liberation. As, quotes, I was spared the fate of those who were murdered. Active guilt stems from having committed immoral acts and unknowingly having chosen not to help when one could possibly have done so. Asserting that